Alright. I decided I'm going to try doing a short reading stream. It's been planned for a couple days, but now actually put it into practice. And I'm starting with a half comedy, half horror book. More comedy than horror. It's a Welcome to Night Vale novel, the horror comedy podcast. It is The Faceless Old Woman Who Secretly Lives in Your Home by Joseph Fink and Jeffrey Cranor. I'll only be reading for about an hour, maybe. We'll see how it goes. I'm not actually experienced in public reading, but figured why not? Let's give it a try. To Meg Bashweiner and to Jillian Sweeney. Craig, 2011. I set your shoes on fire. All of them. They're in the trash can by the rental office. They're still smoldering. The side of the plastic bin has melted away, and Stuart in apartment 413 has already made 4 calls to the super. He didn't answer because I locked him in his bathroom, because I didn't want the fire put out just yet. It's nice, the smell of burning. I used to not like it, as it reminded me of a particularly bad moment in my early life, but that was so many years ago. Now I enjoy the smell of burning. Burning anything. Rubber, cloth, skin in small amounts, hair, definitely hair, even wood, a fireplace on a cool winter night, a campfire on a warm summer night. A house is a family of 4 fleas, leaving behind everything they've ever owned to be consumed by flames. Plus, there's true beauty in black ash quivering around bright orange edges. It's art, Greg. I know you appreciate art. Hi, Namari. I'm reading a book. Also, the birds are alarmed, and I find that funny. You missed your date tonight because you couldn't find your shoes, which is why I'm telling you now that they're on fire in a quickly melting plastic bin. Then, when you tried to rush to a shoe store, your car wouldn't start because somebody broke in and jammed glass shards into the ignition, or at least that's what the locksmith said when she came to investigate the problem. Who would do something like that? You wanted her professional opinion. She only shrugged and said she'd have to replace the ignition switch, which would take a couple days and cost $400. I suppose I could have used the glass shards to slash your tires to keep you from your date. It would have been cheaper for you, but it wouldn't have been as beautiful. I don't think you noticed the perfect arc of blood splatter across the floor mat when you cut your hand on ignition. You screamed in pain, ignoring the beauty of your own nature, so please, take a moment to look out the window by the shower and appreciate the artwork I have created. I call it Craig's Impertinence, Multimedia, Plastic, Gasoline, and Shoes. But you're too busy moping. You've been standing in that shower for 10 minutes. I know because I'm in here with you. A faceless old woman inches from your neck. You would feel my breath if I breathed. I think it would be upsetting for you if you turned around. Better to let the water run over you. Better not to see. You haven't even touched the soap. You look pathetic. Why? Because you missed a date with a woman who was pretty and shared similar loves and seemed genuinely interested in you? Or because when you went to try to reschedule with her, she accused you of texting her an inappropriate photo when in fact you did no such thing? You can't hear me. These are rhetorical questions anyway. I don't need a response. You wouldn't even know how to respond to me. After all, you don't know I'm here. Even after that one day a year ago when you passed by the living room and half noticed the strange new chandelier hanging from the ceiling, the one made from the twisted limbs and the neck of an old woman contorted into the shape like a spider. And then you thought, wait, what did I just see? And you backed up to find that the hanging old woman was gone. Almost certain she was never there. Probably you imagined her. I can see why you're upset. The woman you did not go on a date with is too. No one wants to have a first date cancel on them, and then have the same date inexplicably text them a photo of a raccoon having its intestines gnawed out by a coyote. I mean, I would want that, but I've never really been into dating. Although it is true once that I was deeply in love. So I can only assume most women would not like that kind of behavior. I forgot to mention, she received a text from you while you were trying to get your car fixed that included a photo of a coyote devouring a raccoon. The coyote's fur was a glistening red about the mouth, its eyes golden like a cornfield. The raccoon's neck is clearly broken and its organs are pink and gray. I'm sure she was disgusted, but honestly, she's made of similar materials. So are you, Craig. I'm not sorry I sent her that photo using your phone, and you shouldn't be either. It was a good photo. A discomforting reminder of Snowden's secret. That man is matter. Did you ever read Catch-22? It's a funny and sad book about moral hypocrisy and self-interest. My favorite part is how cold Snowden got when his small intestines unraveled beneath his flak jacket. That's not a spoiler because the book's been out for decades and you should have read it by now. Plus, you can't even hear me. You would have enjoyed your date with Giselle, I'm sure. But that's not the point. The point is that Giselle wasn't right for you. I know this because I've spent the past 3 nights in her home while she slept. I've skittered along the hallway stair behind her as she climbed. I've burrowed into her trash to nap among rotting things. She keeps her possessions quite organized. I like this about her. It made it easier for me to go through her photo albums, medical records, and diaries. I won't go into specifics because that would be invasive, and I'm not like that. Giselle keeps a great deal of physical photos. She likes to look through them when she's feeling nostalgic or overwhelmed. I took a crafty knife and carved away the faces from the photos. I only did this to people who are not her parents or grandparents. I think family is important. Children are the most important. Have you thought about children, Craig? Giselle does not seem interested in having children. She wants to go to law school and open her own firm. She wants to travel a lot too, and you don't want that. Believe me, I've traveled enough for the both of us. The world is awful. There is only flesh and illness out there. You'll be fine right here in Night Vale. Don't worry, Giselle will find another person to date. They will travel and be selfish and not raise a family. They will never know the joy of raising a handsome, gentle, smart boy like you. And they won't care. And that's good for them. I'm only saying you don't want that. I know you, Craig. I know what is good for you, and this would not have been good. Anyway, that bridge is burned now, I suppose, along with your shoes, and you'll never hear from her again. No, I was wrong. She just texted back. You're missing us while you're brooding in the shower, Craig. WTF is wrong with you, she writes. You two are done, before you even got started. Another text. Please don't contact me again. Please. Okay, what I read initially as anger is probably fear. You scared her, Craig. We scared her. I'm going over to her place now to block your number on her phone so she doesn't have to deal with the emotional devastation of getting some mumbly apology text from you. And done. She looks in bad shape. All her lights are out and she's sitting on the edge of her couch staring at nothing. Then for a moment she saw a flicker of me beside her, a crooked figure with no face, and she screamed. She is so dramatic about everything. You are better off. Maybe this is a bad time to bring this up, but you need to pay your credit card bill. It's maxed out and you've missed the past 2 due dates. And the thing is, and this is going to sound selfish because it is, but your Netflix account got suspended. And I was only halfway through season 3 of Cheers. The laugh track is a bit off-putting, but it's still a good show. I really love the plot twist that Norm's nagging wife Vera turns out to have been dead for 10 years, and Norm has kept her memory alive by continuing a fictional narrative about her. Sam and Diane knew that Vera wasn't really alive and that Norm was delusional, but in episode 7, when they go up to check in on Norm, they find him cuddled up next to her decayed corpse and reading her Lord Byron's The First Kiss of Love, and he's crying. The stench is unbearable, but less unbearable than the brutal truth of the moment. My point is, I didn't get to finish watching Cheers because you're behind on your credit card payments, and I need you to deal with that. Also, you're wasting water standing in the shower for so long. Stop brooding, or I will run one of my jagged yellow fingernails along the back of your neck. Your father used to brood all the time, drove your mother crazy. He had a lot of stress and would come home crying. He would sit in his car, parked along a curb a block away, just breathing and sobbing, and breathing some more until his eyes and cheeks were clear of the red lines. Your mother thought he had depression. He did not. It's dangerous to do that to people, you know? Diagnose them with a mental health condition if you're not a doctor. I secretly live in everyone's home, and I have seen people coping and not coping with depression. Your father, Donald, did not have depression. He had a difficult time coming to terms with his cancer, and eventually his body gave out. Lots of men in your family died young, but your father, comparatively, lived a long life. He got to see his 45th birthday, and he got to raise a son. You. When you were little, he called you big man, and when you grew up, and you certainly grew up, 6'3", a quarter foot taller than your own dad by the age of 15, he called you little guy. He loved you and cared for you like your father, like the father he never had. Your paternal grandfather, Jacob, died when your dad was only 7 years old, but Jacob had been in a coma for 4 years before that, after the hunting accident that ripped away nearly half of his skull. He was carrying his shotgun carelessly. He tripped and the gun went off, and as did a good portion of his head. The spray of blood really was beautiful, but I suspect you wouldn't have appreciated it then either. People so rarely take the time to appreciate what is around them. Donald wanted you to have a loving father, someone to teach you to ride a bike, to read, to be respectful to others, to be creative. You were terrible at guitar. To be fair, so was your father, but the more important thing was that it was something that you could be terrible at together. And you've always loved music, even if you can't play a single instrument. Donald was a good and giving father. He loved you. Having a father who loves you is important. I know this well. You're watching your diet, and this is good. I want you to be healthy, and you are. I took some of your blood the other night while you were sleeping. Sorry I couldn't find a syringe and ended up using a knife from Rome that I've carried with me for a very long time. I took your blood to the Night Vale General Hospital and surreptitiously replaced Harrison Kipp's sample. Your blood came back perfect. Apparently this was good news for Harrison too. He and his doctor were so amazed that his extraordinarily high hemoglobin count came back normal for once. Your father's early death haunts you, I'm sure. That's normal, and I'm glad you are health conscious because of it. Your father's body was filled with so many artificial chemicals and carcinogens over the years. His cancers, and there were many, were a product of personal choices, not genetics. I'm old. Older than you can imagine, probably older than I can imagine, and I have met nearly everyone in your family tree going back well over a century. There's very little cancer there, rest assured. Of course, you can't hear or see me, and I'm fine with that, because I'd prefer you stay on your healthy path. But really, please work on your finances. Pay that credit card bill. I want you to take care of yourself because I think you're a nice man, Craig. I've known you your whole life, and you have a beautiful heart. You care so much for your friends, your family, and even the people less fortunate than you. You had only $300 in your account last Christmas, and yet you still donated $200 to Doctors Without Borders. It's hard not to like you, Craig. I want to help you live a good life, raise a good family to teach your future son to love and respect his children. It's what your father would have wanted, what all fathers should want. But please, the water in the shower is starting to run cold, and anyway, the fire truck's just arrived about the pile of burning shoes. Hurry and dry off so you can see the art I made for you. Craig, I'm not going anywhere. You are part of my story, a story that started more than 200 years ago on an estate by the sea. It is a long story, but don't worry. We have so much time still left. Yeah. Mouth ran dry. An Estate by the Sea, 1792 to 1805. I was born on the Mediterranean, on the water itself in a small boat that my father was frantically rowing in order to take my mother to medical care she would never live to need. What chance did I have when my first act was to take another's life? My father let the oars fall once I had arrived and my mother had left. He cradled me with one hand and his wife with the other, and then he made his way back to shore. I was his first and his last child. From then on, we would only have each other. Maybe lesser men would have responded to the trauma of losing a wife by resenting my existence, or by forever associating me with sorrow, but my father was not a lesser man. He buried my mother on the edge of our estate, on a hill overlooking the water she had died upon. When I was very young, he would take me to visit the grave regularly, but as I grew older, he realized I had no memory of a mother, and he himself needed no reminder. And so gradually we visited less and less, and then eventually not at all. Still, once a year, he would go up by himself to the grave and carefully tend to it, clearing off the weeds, making sure the path to it was passable, and that the view from her plot to the water was unhindered. He never married again, nor showed any interest in women. This wasn't an act of misguided nobility. He was so fully occupied by raising a daughter, and by his mysterious work, that there was simply never space for a second act to his romantic life. Maybe if this story had turned out differently, he would have eventually, as an older man, found room in his life for love, but this story could only turn out the way things happened. I cannot conjure a happy ending where none exists. I never missed my mother. I didn't mean this to sound strong or uncaring. I just never knew what a mother was enough to miss one. And my father was such a warm and loving parent that I did not feel a missing piece in my life. Any sorrow I felt was on my father's behalf, for I loved him completely, and I knew her death had been a great blow to him. So at night, in bed, listening to the whispering of the same warm seawater upon which I had come to be and my mother had come to pass, I would lay awake and wish that the tragedy could be undone. But it was never for my own sake. I only ever wanted my father to be happy. Here is what an orange tree smells like. At the base of a tree, it smells of soil, the churn of earth, and the sun that heats it. If it is warm enough to grow oranges, then it is warm enough to bake the soil, and the scent will rise up. A dense, gritty smell, pleasant without being beautiful. When rain comes, the smell changes, becoming sharper, a smell that is as squishy and thick as the mud that makes it. The tree itself smells like a house that will never be finished. Building, the dust of wood, and all that binds wood together. It is a smell that grows with the tree, gaining the smells of what lives on it and around it. A squirrel runs up the bark, and now a squirrel's nest. A faint trace of pungent animal mixes in with the stolid wood smell. Between the continuous vegetable hum of the leaves, there are the flowers that smell more like fruit than the fruit itself. A perfume that smells like a miracle, but is also a reminder that life does not end with humanity. The smell of the flowers is extra human, and it does not need us. It is the smell of running under the hot sun, the smell of falling into cool water. The flowers are the dream of the fruit, and the dream of sweetness to come. And then the fruit themselves, echoes of the flower's perfume, but more tangible. There is a weight to their smell, and when punched open with a thumb, the fizzy aroma of pulp and juice. That is what an orange tree smells like. Excuse me. Our estate had many orange trees, and many other fruit trees besides. It was a large and lush place on a hidden inlet, protected from the damage of storms and the curiosity of a passing ship. The Mediterranean was a dangerous and wild place at the time, full of warships on patrol and merchant ships passing to and from ports of the east, and pirate and bandit ships and other ships with strange flags belonging to mysterious organizations whose memberships and purpose were unclear, but whose menace was evident to all. Our tiny inlet was a blessing, allowing us a modicum of peace despite the apparent richness of our estate. And our estate was quite rich. The land had belonged to my mother's family, wealthy beneficiaries who luxuriated in fine arts and foods, the fawning attention that comes from kind donations to the poor, and a carefree life not beholden to any business or industry. Wealth is either a blight upon the soul or a balm. My mother's family saw money as a privilege, allowing them to read poetry and explore intellectual gentility, which is why they approved of her marriage to my father. A working man with average education. Few rich families of that time would have allowed their daughter to marry into family without wealth, for fear that a dowry would be taken and the young bride and her family ignored. As the son of a merchant, my father spent much of his time of his youth traveling to farms to purchase livestock and to produce them and sell at larger markets in the city. He met my mother one summer while stocking figs in a market not far from the estate. A quick errand into town to buy food turned into a long afternoon of discussion about the sweetest figs in late June. "You can tell the ripest by the smell," he told her, gently holding the green bulb to her nose, as she inhaled the aromas of the golden syrup in the earth. The long afternoon turned into weeks of not-so-accidental meetings between the two, and that became a courtship. The family trusted him so thoroughly, and my mother loved him so fully that no question of integrity of their marriage ever arose. They were married on the grounds of this estate, which was then handed over to the new couple by my mother's parents. My father loved this home. Why would he not? He had developed a nose for the finest produce, and here he could savor every rich grape and every spring onion and every plump orange. Beside the citrus groves, there was the main house, a vast thing inhabited now only by my father and me. There were servants' wings and towers that we left sealed to gather dust. Eventually, we reduced our presence to one small wing of the house, sleeping in adjacent bedrooms, using what was once a small kitchenette for stable workers as our place for both cooking and eating. My father carried the habits of a small merchant family he'd grown up with, and he didn't know what to do with luxury on the scale while it was being offered. Still, the lands were maintained by a variety of servants who came regularly, and the area of our house that we lived in was also well kept. And I did eventually begin to wonder as the years went on how my father was able to pay for the upkeep of such a large and lush estate when he did not seem to have any job in particular, having given up his merchant travels after I was born. This was all so long ago. To parse through my earliest years is difficult. I am an old woman, perhaps the oldest there has ever been. A mind was never meant to catalog this much. A life was never meant to be this long, but I do retain some memories of my earliest and greatest period of joy, when I lived in ignorance of what the world could do to a person. I am 3 years old. This is my earliest memory. I am running through the orange groves. I am chasing my father, or he is chasing me. It is a radiant and clear day. I decide to hide. I wiggle my way up one of the trees. I wedge myself against the trunk a few feet from the leaves. I see my father looking for me. "Where is my daughter?" he says in exaggerated confusion. "Where is her beautiful face? I must see that face again. Where could it be?" Soon I allow myself to fall into the soft dirt, where my father scoops me up and both of us are laughing. Was my face actually beautiful? My father would say so either way. Another moment. I don't know how old I am, probably 5 or so. We are in our little kitchen in our big house, and my father is cooking. I don't remember what he is cooking. I only remember the smell, which is meaty and green, the smell of vegetables cooking in fat. He asks me to cut the bread for our dinner, and he shows me how, supervising my use of the knife, but allowing me to do it myself. "There are only 2 of us, little one," he says. "Both of us need to be able to take care of the other." He shows me where I should cut, but it is I who carefully lowers the knife through the hard crust. The smells of onions and herbs and lamb fills this memory and anchors it forever in my mind. One more memory of my earliest years. It is not like the others. I am 6 years old. Again, I am in the orange groves, but this time on my own. My father is away for the afternoon on business, as happened every week or so, and I am left to play around the estate. I knew every disused shed, every good swimming spot, and each climbable tree in the groves where I could hide and secretly watch the groundskeeper, or the ships in the harbor, or even the deer. I am playing in one of these hidden places, and I see a shape moving forward in an odd stop and start away across the line of trees. I assumed it was one of the gardeners and called for them. No one answers. I am scared, but determined to be able to tell my father how brave I had been, and so I run after the figure. Soon I reach the end of the line of the trees and break out onto the broad grass leading down to the shore, and there by the shore is a man lurching in a strange, stiff manner. He does not turn to look back at me, only shambles to the edge of the rock and then tips forward into the water. I run down to look where he had fallen. The water is clear and shallow, but there is no sign of the man. I decide I must have been mistaken, and I do not tell anyone what I have seen. My father did not wish to know me what he did for a living, and if he had his way, I would likely still not know, but few of us ever get our way in this world. We accommodate what life gives us and do our best to retain some sense of ourselves. Father had a business partner, a man named Edmund. Edmund and my father grew up together, my father nearly 10 years older. My father had looked after the younger Edmund, teaching him to fish and row a boat, teaching the young boy to be in nature, to find work that used the whole of his body, to take in the world in all 5 senses. But Edmund took a liking to math. He was a thinking man, enjoying calculations and finance. Life was Edmund's puzzle to solve, and he was much smarter than most children. And despite their differences, my father had hired a 12-year-old Edmund to help with bookkeeping and inventory at my father's warehouse. And that became a partnership that would last through my father's life. Edmund would frequently join us for dinner, where he would pull faces that made me laugh and ask me questions about what new parts of the estate I had discovered that day. I enjoyed his visits immensely, and it always made me angry when my father would tell me I needed to go to bed so that he and Edmund would have conversations for adults. At 6, of course, I thought I was as adult as anyone could be, and it seemed unfair that I would be left out of these discussions as though I were a child. I would stand at my bedroom door listening through the crack and trying to make out even a single word, but my father was aware of such tricks and always moved the conversation to the far side of the kitchen, where even the sharp hearing of the young would be unable to eavesdrop over the crackle of the fire. All I could hear was the occasional roar of laughter from Edmund, always an enthusiastic man. Despite the annoyance of secrecy, I enjoyed Edmund's visits. In many ways, he became a second father to me. He traveled much for work and was always bringing me little gifts and souvenirs. A painted seashell from France, a tiny bag of cinnamon from Morocco, a figure of a horse from Svitz. He always seemed to be going to a new country, and he always had some trinket of that country for me. They decorated a shelf in my bedroom, and since I never left the estate, they formed a tactile map of the world. This is what Spain sounds like. This is what Francia feels like. Ooh, pardon me. Once, in my younger years, I did stumble upon my father in the midst of his work. I woke up one evening from a dream in which my mother was alive, only she wasn't my mother, but someone very much like my mother. She had no face, and was hiding somewhere in the house, and I couldn't find her. Even as I saw her moving in the corner of my eye, I was crying as I woke. The terror of unknowable entity, an unseeable face still causing me to pant. I ran to my father's room, but he wasn't there. I called for him, and there was no answer. Then I looked out the window and I saw lamps down at the water. Frightened, but determined to find my father, I pulled on a shawl and ran barefoot down through the grass to the water. There I saw my father and Edmund and a third man with a rough, scarred cheek and disheveled clothes. They were pulling a rowboat full of canvas bundles upon the shore. The sharp oil smell of the lamps hit me from several meters away. The man with the scarred cheek saw me, then shouted in alarm, but my father waved him quiet. "There's been a shipwreck, little one," he said to me. "Fortunately, we were able to help with the rescue. Go back to bed. I'll tell you about it in the morning." In the morning, he refused to provide any details. Later, I remember that Edmund had not visited us in months. What had he been doing at the estate so late at night when the shipwreck happened? There is one other person left to mention from my childhood. I don't remember when it was that I met Albert, only that my earliest years he was there. He was 4 days older than me, and so we grew in unison. When I explored the grounds, often Albert was with me. We would play hide and seek in the orange groves. We would swim together in the cove, daring each other to hold our breath longer, to dive farther, to grab stones at the bottom of the deepest point of the cove. He was a better swimmer than me by far. Despite my years with the water, my mother's death caused me to associate the sea with danger, and so I was not as fearless as Albert when it came to these challenges. Once he jumped from a cliff at least 10 meters high, missing the rocks by a few body lengths. It wasn't the water that frightened me, it was the fall. I tried to imagine falling that far, then hitting the water and continuing to fall deep below until I settled on the soft sand at the bottom. When Albert dared me to follow him, I demurred, pretending that I had to go home for dinner. I could see in his eyes that he saw through my excuse, but even as young as we were, he did not take the opportunity to mock me, instead pretending to believe me. Other children from other estates came and went, but Albert was always there. My father, noticing our friendship, would sometimes invite him for dinner, but Albert always had to return to his house. I would ask him about which estate he belonged in, and he would point vaguely in a different direction each time. It became clear he did not want me to visit his home. I sensed he was ashamed of his family, perhaps because they were one of the brutal landlord families always terrorizing the peasants in the nearby valleys, or because he belonged to a strictly religious family that did not like to fraternize with the outsiders. Like my timidity with water, Albert's evasiveness about his home became a thing we did not speak about, because there was always so much delight to do and see instead. Although our estate was difficult to spy from the sea, there were places on nearby cliffs easily accessible from our home from which you could watch the passing ship traffic. And this I did often, enjoying identifying which ships belonged to governments and which were merchant ships, and which were the pleasure yachts of royalty and the rich, and which were the schooners of pirates and bandits that flew no colors, moving stolen cargo and attacking pleasure yachts that had not shelled out sufficiently for mercenaries and bodyguards. Soon, through the boredom and patience of a child, I had a better grasp of the routes in the various factions than most of the well-informed spies of kings and emperors. By age 7, I knew most of the ships in this region by name. If they passed close enough to our cliffs, I might even know the crew members by prominent physical traits. Here is the Bee Sting from Portugal, and the navigator had bushy red hair and a limp. Here's the Lucky Belle, a ship of bandits from right up the coast. their leader missing his left hand, and so it was a great surprise to me when I saw a ship that I did not recognize. The idea of seeing a vessel for which I had no information was so astonishing to me. With the serene certainty of a child, I knew all there was to be known about in this world. This new ship was smaller, like the ships of the bandits, but it flew a flag. The flag was black and had an insignia of a labyrinth on it. There was no crew visible, and the deck was stacked high with crates. It passed slowly, quite close to the cliffs, but I never saw any movement on it. Down the coast, one of the regular bandit ships that often passed our home had swerved sharply to avoid passing close to the ship with the sign of the labyrinth. Of course, I asked my father about the ship, and he frowned and kneeled in front of me. The organization that carries the sign of the labyrinth is an ancient and secret one, and you must never be seen by them. If you spot a ship with the flag of the labyrinth, I want you to run back home and stay inside until it passes. Do you understand? I didn't, but I also understood that I shouldn't ask any more questions, and so I kept quiet when I saw more and more of these strange ships. Crew were rarely ever on deck, and if they were, they wore hoods and worked with their heads bowed. Always the crates piled high on their decks, lashed down with thick rope, and always a flag with the sign of the labyrinth. But I also refused to run away. I would stay hidden and watch them pass until they were lost to the horizon or turned to the shore. When I reached the age of 8, my father started to depart on regular business trips. It would have been good to do this sooner, he said, but I didn't want to leave you alone when you were so young. Now that you are a little older, I will occasionally need to go to attend to affairs. I will return soon, do not worry. He hired a series of caretakers for me during his trips, none of whom lasted long. My father assured me that this wasn't due to any sort of difficulty with caring for me, only that the young workforce in our rural region tended to immigrate to the great capitals of Europe seeking better jobs, and so one was always looking for good help. It was only much later it would occur to me that my father did not want any one person to know the schedule of his trips were, and so was having the caretakers regularly replaced. But I never used my father's absences as an excuse to cause real trouble. I took the responsibility he put on me seriously, and I wanted to prove more to myself than to him that I deserved his trust. And so, while I sometimes sneak out of bed after being put there far too early by some exhausted caretaker or the other, I would only use those hours snatched from sleep as an opportunity to read or to wander the estate in the nighttime. When all familiar landmarks turned to indistinct shadow, or often, I would sit there. I have to change the song. I don't need KK talking in my ear. He was throwing me off a little bit. But I never used my father's absences as an excuse to cause real trouble. I took the responsibility he put on me seriously, and I wanted to prove more to myself than him that I deserved his trust. And so, while I would sometimes sneak out of bed after being put there far too early by some exhausted caretaker or the other, I would only use those hours snatched from sleep as an opportunity to read or to wander the estate in the nighttime, when all familiar landmarks turned into indistinct shadow, or often I would sit precariously on my windowsill, feet dangling over the lengthy drop, smelling the nearby sea. I had never in my life been far enough from the sea that I couldn't smell it, at least as a faint undercurrent under the other smells that filled my life. On one of my father's trips, I snuck out in the morning to meet with Albert. We played hide and seek, and then ate a simple lunch of fruit and cheese on a rock by the cove, our toes dangling in the water. "There are rumors about your father," he said. "No, there aren't," I glared at him. "What kind?" "I don't know," he shrugged and stuffed a large piece of cheese in his mouth. "Help me." "People say your father is some kind of spy for a king, or even an agent of the devil, for his journeys are crime journeys." Albert nodded solemnly. "Or crimes." I shoved him into the water, and he came up sputtering, and I kicked water in his face. "That's stupid. Don't say stupid things like that to me ever again." I ate the rest of the cheese, all in just a few bites, just to punish him, although later this would be more of a punishment on me. Despite my dismissal, what Albert said stayed with me. What did my father do? How did we afford this estate? And why was he never specific about where he was going on these business trips of his? I started to pay more attention to his comings and goings, and I noticed there was a great variability in how he packed. On some trips he brought a full trunk, which he would struggle to load onto a carriage before leaving, but on the other trips he packed lightly and haphazardly, throwing only a few necessities into a sack and then taking off on a horse. The care with which he packed did not correlate at all with the length of his business trips. The mystery was deepened by an even stranger discovery. One night, against the repeated increasingly desperate commands of my current caretaker, I was sitting awake in my windowsill. Despite my disobedience, my body did very much want to comply with the command to sleep, and so I was gently nodding off, leaning against some sturdy stone frame, when I heard a voice out in the garden. Hidden as we were, we never had to contend with thieves, but ours was a large estate, and so theft was always a possibility. Perhaps our time had finally come, and my father was not here to help. As I sprang up, quite awake now, I realized to my absolute confusion that I recognized the voice. It was the voice of my father. He was in the garden, 2 days into a week-long business trip. My first impulse was to run out and joyously greet him, assuming that he had returned earlier than expected, but something about the situation made me cautious. Instead, I slipped out of my room, past my caretaker who had fallen asleep while reading at the table in the kitchen, and out the front door. I moved as quietly as I could through fields and gardens, ducking behind hedges and trees, and there my father was, walking with a group of men down to the water. A rowboat waited on shore, and in the deeper water of the cove, one of the small ships that bore no flag. One I recognized as belonging to the bandits. My father was chatting with the men from the ship, and he even affectionately slapped the back of one. I had no idea what to make of this, but in my horror, started to realize that perhaps Albert had been right. Perhaps my father was going on crime trips. To do crime. As I came to this realization, I saw movement in the hill above the group of men. A figure was walking along the crest. No one but me noticed this figure. I recognized him. It was the shambling man whom I had seen disappear into the water a few years ago. He walked along the hill with his strange, stiff lurch, too far away to be anything but a silhouette in the faint moonlight, but his movements were unmistakable. Then he crossed the threshold of the hill and was gone. I hurried back to my bed where I ended on sleeping until my caretaker called me to breakfast. When my father returned from the trip, I greeted him as normal and said nothing for a few days. Then one day, during a lunch, I casually told him that I had dreamed a vivid and unusual dream while he was away. He grunted interest, but did not immediately pay attention. I told him that I dreamed of his voice in the garden while he was gone, that I had crept out and followed the sound, and that I had seen him talking with a group of bandits down by the cove. My father set his food aside and glared at me. He bit his lip, debating with himself for a moment. Then he sighed. "It doesn't seem like you're telling me a dream," he said. "Papa, why are you here when you are supposed to be away on a business trip? Why did you lie to me?" "Not everyone gets to know everything about everybody." "Tell me," I shouted, a young girl despising her inability to control the tone and volume of her voice, her face trembling with the effort of holding in tears. My father nodded slowly, and then he leaned in and addressed me quite seriously. "All right, my little one. I suppose you would need to learn this eventually. I was hoping to wait a while longer, but life rarely gives us what we want. I will tell you what it is I do on these trips, and I'll let you into a secret of my life, but this is a deadly serious thing, and you must be responsible enough to tell no one, as one careless word from you is likely to get one or both of us killed. Can you promise this?" I nodded, terrified but also determined to live up to my responsibility. My lips trembled and tears poured from my eyes, which I was ashamed of, but I was young and the heaviness of this moment was overwhelming. My father took my hands into his very large, warm hands, and his face softened. "Very well," he said. "This is my secret." Here is what the sea smells like. It is more of a texture than scent, because the sea is primarily made of two substances that have no smell on their own: water and salt. Salt has no smell, but makes the air sting, and so of all the other smells, the seas are layered. So all the other smells of the sea are layered upon the pang of salt. Water has no smell, but instead a comfort. We feel moisture as life, and so the smells of the ocean are layered upon the contentment of the water. Salt is treble and water is bass. I don't know how I know this is true, but I know it is true. The sea smells like old wood and wet leaves, like cold mud and warm stone, like every creature who has ever lived in it, a churning graveyard and nursery. like winds from the inland carrying the hot circulation of life and winds from the ocean carrying the distant froth of waves against ships and islands, like gray only more so, like blue only less so. A deep note of rot mixes with the sterile cleanliness of saline, and the result a mottled of clear and foam smells so much like itself that an old woman who hasn't smelled it in years, living in a desert town with no water at all, an uncrossable distance from the sea, smelling it faint on the breeze, will stop and be cast back to her life on an estate by the sea, and for her it will smell like her childhood. This is what the sea smells like. My father was a smuggler. He and Edmund and his business partner had been running a smuggling business since before I was born and my mother had died. It wasn't always this way, he said. Your mother's family had money, but they did not work, and their fortunes dwindled with age. By the time they died, we had far more property than wealth. There weren't the funds to keep the grounds or to pay the staff. Before you were born, child, the orange groves were filled with weeds. The gardens were tangles of overgrowth. Your mother and I didn't know what to do. I had no money of my own, no prospects, and there was no good way, then or now, for a woman to make a fortune in this narrow-minded country. He guided me to the window and gestured toward the sea. Then one day, looking out this very window, I realized our salvation. The sea would save us. A little bit of the sea. Our cove. I looked out past his pointing finger. Yes, our cove. Difficult to find without a guide, but deep enough for a small ship, sheltered against storms. In the old days of your mother's family used to house their yacht. Amid a literal sea of fishers and merchants, your mother's family lived a life of privilege and comfort. They owned no business, generated no new wealth. They simply enjoyed that which they had. The money outlived your grandparents, but not outlived your mother and I. We sold the yacht before you were born, along with jewels and art no longer befitting our common status. I was good at selling and delivering goods, and I realized that our beautiful hidden cove could be perfect for smuggling. But I didn't know the first thing about smuggling. I needed help. Uncle Edmund, I said. He was a smuggler. My father laughed. No, my daughter, Edmund is an accountant. He shook his head affectionately. But a crooked one. He helped us through the tough times, utilizing creative mathematics. I came to him with an idea. I would provide the perfect landing spot for smugglers and an expertise in the local conditions and currents. He would find people interested in having their goods brought in without passing through the heavy taxes and duties of the ports. Such people, it turns out, were not difficult to find, and so gradually our business grew. Edmund finds clients, helps with the movement of the goods beyond our estate, and finds ways to hide our income from government inspectors, and I safely bring the ships in and out of our cove. Often when I am away on business, I am actually away. We must ensure that the goods reach their owners safely and secretly, and that the overland travel is sometimes quite far, but there are times, yes, that I pretend to be away so I can work secretly at the cove on the arrival of a large shipment of merchandise. I apologize for lying to you. It breaks my heart every time, but it is only for your protection. I couldn't tell you why I would need to be awake and out all night and asleep during the day, and I didn't want you near any of the sailors. Are they dangerous? I asked, worried for the only parent I had left, but also a little excited at the prospect. No, he said, but acts of crime tend to make even harmless people seem nervous, and nervous people can be unpredictable. He shook his head. Enough for now, child. The truth has been told. This is all too much for a young one. Let's get back to our lunch. But I wasn't hungry anymore. I was excited and scared. I couldn't decide which. Years passed as they do. I was 9, then 10, then 11. These were the last few years of true happiness I had left, although I had no way of knowing that at the time. My father continued to go on business trips. Although he had no longer pretended to leave when receiving a shipment, he would only forbid me to go outside after sunset and ask me to be in charge of my own meals the next day. I would sit in my window all night, anxiously waiting for his return, and so was always sleepy as he was the next morning. I looked at Edmund in a new light. Before, he had always been a purely friendly, goofy presence, full of jokes and games. He still was, but now I had the context of his job, and my respect for him deepened. There was a man who could go out into the kingdoms of Europe offering smuggling services to all sorts of low characters, and return to play backgammon with me at our kitchen table, attempting to cheat in intentionally obvious ways so that I could catch him and berate him, which amused us both. Over one of these games, when I was 9, I stopped, unsure of how to say what I wanted to say. It's your turn, little one, he said, or do you want me to take another? Is my father safe? I asked abruptly, having failed to find a way to ease into the subject. Will my father be okay when he goes out to, do his work? Edmund grew serious and he pushed the game board aside. I will never let any harm fall upon your father, he said, in a solemn voice. and I will never let any harm fall upon you." He smiled. "Anyway, your father does the easy stuff. He'll be fine. I'm the one sticking my neck out. Now, are you going to take your move, or what?" Albert and I continue to meet and play regularly. He asks sometimes about my father, about the rumors, but I never answered one way or the other, preferring to change the subject by poking or daring him to do some foolish act of bravery off one of the old crumbling buildings of the estate. Eventually, he understood that I would not say more than I had, and he stopped asking, and our friendship again became one of childhood joy and games and silence about any subject that could distract us from that. Of course, I regularly tried to talk to my father for more information about what he did. I wanted so badly to be of use, but he grew uncharacteristically stern at the subject and would only shake his head. I never gave up, for I loved and admired my father, and knew that any work he did was work that I one day wanted to do too. A change in our routine came suddenly late in my 11th year. It was a night that my father was set to receive a shipment. He had let me stay up with him as he waited, but when it arrived, he had put me in my bedroom and forbidden me to leave. I, as ever, sat awake in my window, waiting for him to come back inside so that we could both rest. I could hear the mindless babble of the waves, and perhaps, although it might have been my imagination, the creak of the wood from the bandit ship that I knew was anchored in our cove. Generally, this was all I had ever heard or saw on these nights, the transaction done so quietly and quickly that no trace of it was noticeable even from our own estate. That night, however, was different. I heard alarmed shouting, loud enough to risk alerting the inhabitants of neighborhood estates. I rushed out of my room and out of the house without thought or hesitation. I would figure out how to help when I got to the cove. My father was all I had, and I would give up everything down to my own life to preserve him. I raced barefoot across the fields towards the water, but some instinct made me duck behind a small rise before I got close to the source of the shouting. And from this hidden place I observed my father surrounded by the crew of bandits from the ship. They were the same group I had seen before with my father, but the circumstances were different this time. The man with the scarred cheek was holding a knife to my father's throat. My father stood tall, unshaking, maintaining eye contact with his assailant. "I have no money here," he said. The bandits jeered at him, and the man with the scarred cheek pressed the knife into my father's neck. "An estate this rich," the man said. His voice gave me a lurch in the gut, because it was not the voice of a man who was acting on a whim, but a man of serious and set on a goal, intent on achieving it. "And you, a smuggler for all these years, don't lie to me, or I will cut out your tongue before I gut you. If there is no money in this home, then there will also be no life." Before my father could reply in a way that might cause him any harm, I took a large rock from the ground and hurled it with great accuracy, born of years and dares and games with Albert. The rock thumped dully against the man's head, and he collapsed, dropping the knife. The other bandits were confused, having clearly been rallied by their leader and unsure of what to do without his motivation. My father immediately set himself upon them, increasing the confusion. I sprang forward, dashing for the knife. The man with the scarred face was dazed but awake. Blood ran down his face. He pawed about in the grass, his fingers batting the hilt, trying to get a grip. I made it to the blade first, and without thinking, fumbled it into my hands, and in the same motion, drove it toward the man with the scarred face. I struck something and heard a scream. The other men fled, and my father, bruises and blood visible now upon his face, scooped me up in a tight embrace. I looked down at the man with the scarred face, who I had stabbed in the thigh. He was bleeding from 2 different places, looking at me with a fierce hatred. Edmund had rushed to the estate as soon as the messenger from my father had delivered the news. Seeing my father swollen, reddened faced, Edmund said in a light-hearted voice, full of mock exasperation, "I suppose we have to find a new crew." My father sighed, and Edmund gave him a large hug and a laugh. "I'm so glad you're both okay." Even in his joking, Edmund was right. They had used this crew for years and had trusted them. My father and he would have to start over finding a new group of Confederates, and also now had to learn to temper their trust in those who came from the world of banditry. My father was quiet. He watched me with deep consideration. He had made sure I was physically unharmed, and then had warmed me some chocolate over the fire for me, which I now drank with the simple joy of a child who was awake past her bedtime and drinking chocolate. I was remarkably unbothered by what had occurred, and about my own attack on that man. It had felt natural to me. This may have been my first sign of vocation, although I did not recognize it as such. My father perhaps did, and he looked over with a deep thought and care. "I suppose," he said, "that it is time for you to learn more about the business." "Really?" I said with happiness. "Really?" Edmund said with surprise. "You didn't see how she handled herself out there," my father said to Edmund. "She showed foresight, and she was quick. This won't be the last situation like this. We can no longer ignore the dangers of our business, and if my daughter is to be around this kind of danger, then I would rather she be prepared. It would be less dangerous, Edmund said, with the tone of someone bringing up an argument that its course had run for years. If we partnered with the Duke's Own, let them take the risk. We are not pairing up with those assassins and thieves, my father said in the same tone. We may be criminals, but we are honest criminals. I won't let my family name mix with an organization involved in murder, banditry, slavery, and who knows what else. On the many nights my father had left me alone, I had taken to reading books in a small library. I knew all about the Duke's Own. They were a notorious syndicate of pirates, racketeers, and swindlers. The reach was vast, covering Europe, Russia, and northern Africa. The Duke of the Duke's Own was a myth, a sleight of hand played by whichever pirate was handy enough when they needed a figurehead or a phantom for authorities to fruitlessly pursue. In actuality, the membership made decisions through general election, and in this way the organization was far more democratically run than any government on the continent. Still, the Duke's Own was a brutal organization that pillaged small farms, abusing and killing innocent people who dared to defend all that they had owned. The Duke's Own had politicians, military leaders, bankers, and merchants as members. The deeper their roots, the more secure their operations. I could understand Edmund's strategy for joining such a powerful group. They could protect us not only from smaller criminals like the ones who attacked my father, but also even large, more frightening groups like the mysterious Order of the Labyrinth. If we made the right political connections, the Duke's Own could even protect us from the possibility of prison. But my father was adamant, and Edmund backed off. Perhaps one of these days you will change your mind, sighed Edmund. I will not have my daughter connected to a corporation of murderers and plunderers. Enough! My father turned to me. We must learn to protect ourselves from such people, not become them. Tomorrow we begin your education. I first learned the complete structure of my father and Edmund's smuggling operation. Their clients were the owners of the merchant ships and pleasure yachts, bringing in a fruit and spice, and gold and cloth from ports in the east or from Morocco or Egypt. A close eye was kept on me during these shipments because the various squabbling kingdoms of Europe all wanted their share of any goods passing to the ports. On the other hand, the Mediterranean was thick with bandit ships, and no eyebrows were raised at the occasional shipment of goods lost to pirates. A cost of doing business. But of course the bandits were my father and Edmund's bandits, and they did not take by force. They tied on peacefully to ships who had prepared for their arrival, and whose crew helped the bandits with the transfer of cargo. Then the bandits took the cargo to our cove, where it was unloaded and transported by land back to the owners, minus a cut for smugglers. The bandits enjoyed the situation too, since there was much less risk of violence and injury boarding a ship that wanted you aboard, and much less risk of jail since the ships always waited a considerate amount of time before reporting the attacks. Edmund and my father had underestimated the bandits' greed, but the old crew was soon replaced with the new one, more carefully vetted and less of a violent reputation, who for the time being at least seemed content with their roles. My father hired mercenaries to guard the estate for a year or so, in case of any of the old crew returned seeking revenge, but nothing happened, and eventually he decided he couldn't justify the expense and we returned to our old way of living. Along with the details of the business, I learned much of the trade from my father and from Edmund and from the crews, whom I became involved in with the business. I was allowed to interact with them more. They treated me as a novelty, and from them I learned, unbeknownst to my father, how to pickpocket, how to open locks, and several other tricks. I would make Albert act as my test subject, keeping a cork in his pocket all day while I would try to steal it as we went about our games. Albert never again brought up the rumors about my father, and I would have them denied if he had, but I could see in his eyes, and he knew that they weren't merely rumors. For the first year or so, Albert caught me every time, but eventually I was able to regularly slip the cork out without his noticing. He tried to learn as well through my second-hand lessons, but he could never find the aptitude. I discovered great satisfaction in these new skills. I would sit for hours in front of the old back door practicing breaking into the lock until my fingers ached and the keyhole was fogged with perspiration from my nostrils. Edmund, who networked with the wealthy and criminal alike, taught me much about the art of persuasion and manipulation. Nothing must ever be your idea, he explained. If I want you to go to bed and I tell you to do so, you'll rebel. But if I simply set up a situation in which you will have the idea to go to bed yourself, then you will go satisfaction, thinking you have won, even as you do exactly what I wanted you to. Remember that, because it will give you far in life. Short-lived pride at winning a disagreement is a fool's game. It is far better to let the other side think they have won, as they have coincidentally decided to do what you wanted all along. He winked at me, then tried to switch 2 pieces on the backgammon board, and laughed when I slapped his hands. For my father's part, he wanted me to be able to protect myself, and so taught me how to use a knife. I soon became adept with all sorts of defensive and offensive uses of a small blade, and I would, with my father's consent, practice fighting with the crew, using short lengths of wood until I was soon best in even the most skilled of them. I think my father allowed this practice because he wanted them to think of me always as potentially very dangerous, but even my father did not understand the full potential of how dangerous I could become. Alright, I will call that there. My throat feels a little raw. I am apparently not used to reading out loud for an hour straight. We have gotten to page 38. I have not much more to say. I will continue this some other time. I'm again not sure. I do plan on streaming more later tonight. Xenosaga, I have some more homework to do. If I stream tomorrow, which I plan on streaming tomorrow because I'll have nothing else to do, it will primarily just be Xenosaga. Because I'm going to let my throat kind of rest after this, because my god, does it feel raw. I did not think it was going to be this kind of feeling, but I enjoy it. This is a very good book. I have been hydrating this entire time, don't worry. I've got a big cup of like my tea and a bottle of water. You know, I don't want to say that doesn't surprise me, because I don't know you that well, but for some reason, that does not surprise me, Namari. I am also kind of surprised you have been here this entire time. This book is more of a, I don't want to say it's a kid's book, but it's young adult, but it's still a fun read. I used to listen to the podcast all the time, Welcome to Night Vale, and this is a backstory to one of the characters. And it's a book written by the creators of the podcast. I need to find a bookmark. But yeah, I'm going to log off now. I'm going to finish up my homework. I'm going to drink a lot of tea and have my voice rest up, and I might be on later. If not later, I will definitely be on tomorrow. So thank you for sitting around and enjoying this book with me, and I will talk to you later.